Hey, welcome to my channel. Thanks for visiting this page and checking out the video. My name is Casey, and I got the inspiration to start this video series from a good friend of mine. Last year, she became a first-time mom and gave birth to a son, and she has a YouTube channel, and she documented her journey through what it was like through the pregnancy and birth and just that whole journey of becoming a first-time mom. And last year I also started the journey to become a first-time mom, but in a very different way. I chose to become a licensed foster parent. Just a little background, I live in the upstate area of South Carolina, and I am 30 years old. I'm single. I don't have any children of my own, and I will talk some about religion in these videos, but I just have always felt called to be a mom, and since that hasn't worked out for me naturally, I felt like the Lord was really laying it on my heart to become a foster parent, so that I could help kids in need. I've always had a passion for children, and always dreamed of being a mom, so that felt like the perfect avenue for me to both fulfill that mothering aspect, but also give back to kids in need. So I started the journey actually a year ago in May. Currently today is May the 12th, 2021, and on May 13th, 2020, is when I first submitted my application to apply to become a foster parent. Now granted, last May 2020 was in the height of when everything was just starting shutting down for COVID, and lots of restrictions in place. So, and the things I talk about in my process, if you're watching this later down the road, that might look a little differently, because I know a lot of our trainings in the licensing process, a lot of it was online due to COVID, but I know regularly they hold those in person. So also, just as a disclaimer, I'm not doing this as any form of being an expert in foster care or necessarily, but just sharing with you my journey. So keep in mind, each state and even each county may have different regulations as far as what their process looks like. So again, this is my journey. So some of the rules and regs I talk about here might look different in your area depending on where you're pursuing this. But just as a little background, so really the way I got started is I just Googled, honestly, how to become a foster parent in your area. So I put in my specific city in the state I'm located in and just Googled, and it sent me to a link within the local Department of Social Services, which here we call DSS. I know other places it's like Department of Families and Services, DFHS. It may have different acronyms and that type of thing. So I'm just kind of referring to that loosely. You can see my fur baby in the background. He thinks he has to be a part of everything. That's Halo. But so I went on to our local website and just submitted an application. It was a Wednesday, May the 13th. And then on Friday, May the 15th, so just a couple days later, I received an email from the local training agency in this area, which is called Heartfelt Calling. They reached out to me, just thanked me for my interest, and kind of gave me the next steps, which in that email included information about registering for an orientation. And I was able to register for the orientation and take that on June 11th. So approximately like a month later, I was able to attend an orientation. In that orientation, it really just focused on what types of children come into foster care. And what I mean by that is it really strongly focused on, the types of situations as far as abuse and neglect, and being trauma informed as far as knowing and understanding that these kids, sometimes destructive or outbursts in behavior comes from the fact that they come from trauma, or just pure neglect. You may have children that come into your care that maybe they weren't, they didn't have proper housing arrangements, sometimes homeless, or maybe they're just not well fed, or things of that nature, and just not clean, not taken care of. Or it could be more severe. I mean, they could face physical abuse from a parent, or a step parent. And then in your most severe cases, sometimes you have, sexual abuse where they're abused by someone in the household sexually. And those are all things that you need to think about and consider before entering this process. And do your research. If you're not familiar with how trauma affects behavior in children, just, research it, look it up. Fortunately for me, I had a little bit of understanding, more probably than the average individual, because I am a social worker. That is my background. I have my master's in social work, and I work in a local hospital as a social worker. So I don't necessarily deal with abused and neglected children all the time, but I do run into cases regularly at the hospital that I have to make reports on. So I kind of knew a little bit, and in my education had been trained on trauma-informed practice and those types of things. But if you're not familiar with that, don't stress about it, because really your child doesn't need you to be a therapist or an expert or anything. They just need you to be a parent and love them, and you'll learn to adapt to those behaviors and what works and what doesn't. And even me, having that background, I dealt with my placements. There's things that, even if you have experience, you're not necessarily going to know all the right answers to. There's not a black and white handbook on how to do this. So don't stress about that part. If this is what you feel led to do, your children can definitely use your love and care. So don't let that deter you. But then that orientation really just focused on what all would be entailed in the licensing process, as far as background checks and fire inspections and that type of thing. And so just kind of some of the laws that go around that. But again, that's going to be different depending on where you live in your state and their regulations. And then at the end of that orientation, they actually asked us in the messaging box to respond to say if we were interested in moving forward or not. And this was also a dual training for both people wanting to foster and adopt through foster care. Now, I will tell you some things I learned retrospect that I didn't know going into that orientation. First, in my area, as of June of last year, so right when I was getting started, they changed the rules, and you can no longer get licensed directly through DSS. So it used to be you got licensed through your local DSS agency, again referring to Department of Social Services, and then when they got calls, then they reached out to the families that they had licensed. As of June 2020, in this area, and I don't know if this is everywhere, but in this area, the rule now is that you have to go through a third-party licensing agency, which there's a ton of these nonprofit agencies that do home studies and license foster parents. That was to take some of the burden off of DSS, I believe, but I found this to kind of be honestly a downfall in some ways, because I think you get less calls because these agencies services multitude of counties. Therefore, anytime there's a placement request in any of those counties, it goes to these agencies, and then all of these agencies start working on the placement. So therefore, you have more hands in the pot and more options. Therefore, I feel like that limits the number of calls you get. So, if you're looking to have a child on a fairly regular basis, this could hinder that. So just be forewarned of that. The other thing is, in my area specifically, in the state of South Carolina, they've closed off all people that want to apply just to adopt out of foster care. You can no longer sign up just to be an adoptive placement. You can only sign up to foster. And that's because they have so many families right now wanting to adopt out of foster care, which I guess is a good thing. I mean, there's people out there wanting these kids, but in retrospect, for someone like me that, while I do want to do it to foster and help a multitude of children, I do hope that one day I might find a forever child through this process. Unfortunately, the only way that can work at this point is if my current placement at the time would become free for adoption because reunification has been taken off the table and they terminate parental rights. Then I could be considered as one of the multitude of possibilities in that adoption, meaning that because they're currently in my care, I would then be considered for potential adoption. But I would be in line with all these other people who are already joined before that cutoff and also are wanting to adopt. So that was a little discouraging to me, but again, it's not impossible. You do have that potential if your placement eventually gets free for adoption. But again, if you're going into it with that's the only goal, not saying it's a bad thing, just know that it's probably unlikely, and that you're probably just going to be a temporary placement for this child, or the children that come into your care. And ultimately, the job of the Department of Social Services is to reunify these families and to help parents, get back to a place where they can care for these children. So if that's discouraging to you, you may want to reconsider why you're doing this, simply because that is the goal. I mean, the goal is not for them to be with you permanently. That's kind of a last resort. And so just making sure that you understand that and that mind frame settles okay with you is a big deal. You need to be ready for that, because more than likely they're going to go back home, or they're going to place them with alternate family. Most of the time they're not going to be with you permanently. And really, you can serve as an advocate in this position, not only for the child, but also that birth family. And a lot of times, they will allow birth families and foster parents to have a relationship moving forward if both parties are in agreement, just to help kind of foster that parent support group as far as what they have moving forward to be able to parent appropriately. So if you feel like you would never be able to work with these parents that at one point harmed or neglected their children, again, just think about those things ahead of time, because you got to be prepared for that reality. And you need to be willing to work with those birth families for sure. So after that orientation, they asked us to respond in the chat. I don't know if I finished that thought earlier when I started on that, but just asked if you're still interested in moving forward after the orientation. Then you just responded yes, and you responded if you wanted to move forward with adoption or fostering. And again, adoption at this point, they're not allowing new families to become certified, so you have to be willing to just foster. And again, that's in this area of South Carolina. I don't know that that's true everywhere. But so that was June 11th. And then after I finished that, I got information on how to complete fingerprints at a local licensed provider. And I had my fingerprints officially ran on July the 3rd. So a few weeks later, I was able to go get fingerprints done. And I actually had to drive to a different county. It was quite a process. But again, worth it in my opinion if this is truly what you want to do. And then shortly after that, so I did fingerprints on July 3rd and July 9th. I actually was assigned a family specialist through my licensing agency. I personally am licensed through Thornwell, and my specialist reached out to me, like I said, July 9th, and introduced herself. And she is wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I could sing her praises all day long, just for confidentiality purposes. I'm not going to share her information with you, but if you ever want to know more about Thornwell, you can let me know in the chat or in the comments below. I'll be happy to kind of give you some more information. But she's been wonderful through the process, and that is one thing I like about the fact that it has gone to third-party agencies. That is definitely a plus, is that you have an individual assigned representative to help you through the licensing process, and also to be your advocate with DSS if you have problems with your DSS worker once you have a placement. And so she has been truly, truly beyond helpful and encouraging and supportive, and just helped me walk through the process very smoothly. And then after that, in late July, you have a 2-day pre-service training. So I attended that July 21st and 23rd. And again, all of this, the orientation and the pre-service training for me was all virtual online, from the comfort of my home. But it was 7 hours a day for 2 days, so 14 hours total. So pretty much full 2 days of training. And this training covered more, again, the things that I kind of mentioned, as far as you need to consider what your limits are, what behaviors you'd be able to handle, what background of children you'd be able to handle. What are your limits? That's something that you need to identify too. If you know that there's no way you could handle the trauma or the situation of someone who's been sexually abused, and a child that might act out in sexual ways. Some of these kids, unfortunately, have very premature sexual behaviors, masturbation, wanting to touch others inappropriately. So you need to, kind of think about what are the extremes that you would be uncomfortable with. And that's really what the pre-service training is about, is identifying those boundaries for yourself and what placements would work well for you and which ones wouldn't. And then later on, when you get all your paperwork to submit for the licensing process, they actually give you a checklist of behaviors that you would or would not be okay with, things that you would be able to handle or not handle. The only absolute no-go for me, I'm pretty open, but I did say that I could not take a child that has shown violent behaviors towards animals. As you saw, I think in the beginning of the video, my small dog in the background, and I just personally, wouldn't be able to handle that if a child already has known behaviors of harming an animal. Now, granted, these kids come into custody and sometimes they know absolutely nothing about the child, so we don't really know if these behaviors exist, and unfortunately they get to your home and sometimes these things that you said would be an absolute no, they still present themselves, and you just have to, at that point, determine, are you going to, move forward with the placement, or are you going to request that they be moved elsewhere? But that was the only no-go for me. I said no kids that have previous history of harm to animals. And then, so after the 2-day pre-service training, then I was able to set up my fire inspection, which they just have the fire marshal of your county come out and look at your home. Again, this probably differs depending on your area as far as what the regulations and rules are, but basically I think the sum of it is you have to have working smoke detectors in every room, in the bedroom specifically. You have to have a fire extinguisher that's in date and accurate. In my area, they have to be mounted, and I can, if you want more information on that, or want me to show you exactly what that looks like, I can do a separate video on that. But yeah, you have to have working fire extinguisher, mounted, working fire alarms. If you have a fireplace, you have to have a carbon monoxide monitor in your house. I think you also have to have one if you have an enclosed carport or garage. There's lots of regulations. You have to have a fire plan, safety plan in place that you have posted somewhere in the house. You do have to do fire drills with your kiddos while they're in custody, so that they know the evacuation plan. Obviously age appropriate. I mean, if you have a newborn or a child that can't walk, they're not going to be able to participate in that, but you still need to go through the motions with them. I think those are quarterly. I think you have to do them every 3 months. And then, so I had my fire inspection on August the 12th, just kind of moving through the process. And then mid-August after that, I worked on submitting all the paperwork. So my worker really emphasized that this is where the process can either go really quickly or really slowly depending on you and how quickly you submit this stuff. So it is a ton of paperwork. I think I completed like 40 pages of paperwork, but I kind of looked back through my information just to kind of give you an idea of what each of those are. So you had to consent for a background check for yourself, and you had anybody that you plan to use as a babysitter. So anybody that's going to be providing childcare more than 3 days a week, I believe is the regulation here. They also have to consent to a background check. You have to fill out an autobiography about yourself, about your education, about, if they ask you about if you've ever had any substance use problems or mental health problems or any medical problems that might interfere with a placement. Now, I did ask some questions regarding this because I am a type 1 diabetic. I have an insulin pump that I have to wear continuously. I've been diabetic since I was 4 years old, but it's pretty well regulated. So that did not interfere with my ability to become a foster parent. If you have an underlying condition like that, don't stress. As long as it's well regulated and your doctor would sign off that you're not, that's not going to impede your ability to care for a child, then you're okay. I even heard that one family, the mom had cancer, and as long as that's in check, I mean, you're in remission, that kind of thing, then they're pretty lenient. Now obviously if you're in your last months, or it's something that's very terminal in the near future, that may hinder your ability to become a foster parent. But if it's something chronic or even acute that's well managed, that they don't feel is like a direct threat or harm to your ability to parent, then you should be okay. Again, not speaking as an expert, don't take this to the bank. Don't present it to your licensing person as any kind of evidence or proof. I am not in any way a foster care service professional. I'm just sharing my experience and what I was told through the journey. You also have to fill out a family history. Again, ask questions about anybody in your family, if they've ever struggled with certain health conditions, mental health, addiction, those types of things. You have to create a disaster plan. So you have to name, I think it's 3 locations that you would go in the event of a natural disaster or an emergency. So if you have, luckily I have family out of state. So if it was something that affected just this region, then I named them that I would move out of the area. And then also I named one person locally so that if it was just a disaster in my specific area, like a fire in my home or a flood or something like that, that I could evacuate somewhere close. But then I also had 2 out of state evacuation plans. Now, that is something too. Let me just take a little detour here on the out of state. So I was really worried because I do have a lot of family out of state. I actually don't have any family in the state that I'm in. And I was really worried about that because I have heard in the past that it's very hard to be able to get permission to take your foster children across state lines. But there is a law that was passed, and don't quote me on this, but I think it's called the Prudent Parenting Act. And it was passed, I think in I want to say 16 or 17. Anyway, it allows you to allow your foster child to basically go anywhere you would take your own children, and leave your kids in the care of anyone that you would leave your own children in the care of. Meaning that you're the current parent in that situation and they trust your judgment as far as where you're taking them. Now, you do still, if you take them out of state lines, you still have to notify DSS and your licensing worker ahead of time. It's not something you can just go and then tell them about later. So you do still have to notify them, but you don't have to get any type of written or court permission to do so. So I can take my foster child, into the next state to see my family, or a couple states away to visit family if I let them know ahead of time. Then you also have to sign a firearm agreement. Basically, if you have any firearms in the home, you have to prove and show that they are stored appropriately, that a child could not have access to those in the home. Then you also have to complete a discipline agreement. And the main thing about this is that you have to understand, as a foster parent, there's no corporal punishment allowed. So you are not allowed any kind of physical ramifications for behaviors. You can use timeout all day long. You can take away toys, electronics, whatever. But you cannot spank. You cannot give a slap on the hand. You can't do any type of physical punishment. And I am certified for age range 0 to 5. But I've also heard with teenagers, there's some restrictions on, you can't physically keep them from leaving the house. You can't harbor them inside your home. You can tell them they're not allowed to leave, but you can't physically do anything to stop them from leaving. You also have to be careful about limiting their technology if they have their own phone. That can be seen as a danger if you're not allowing them access to the outside world. As far as if they can't call for help, if they feel like they need it, that type of thing. So just be careful and speak with your licensed agency directly if you are housing kids that might have a phone, on all the rules and regs there, because I know it gets kind of sticky there as far as how much phone time you can take away in those situations. But basically that discipline agreement is just saying that and you understand that you're not going to cause any physical harm to this child through discipline. You also have to, again, do that factor checklist, which is, again, just naming or identifying any behaviors or specific needs. And this could be healthcare needs. If you don't want a child that has healthcare problems already established, you can identify that as well in that factor checklist. And again, don't feel embarrassed or ashamed for saying that you couldn't handle something or that you don't want to take on something, because in order for it to be the best placement for that child, they need to put them with someone who has said, you know what, I can do this, I can handle it. So if you have any doubts, just check no, you don't want it. That way you don't have to worry about it, because you definitely don't want to get in over your head and then just have to replace the child, because that's more trauma for the child to have to be find another placement. Then you also have to do just a foster application, just your basic demographics, where you live, what type of home you live in, that type of thing, in order to foster. You also have to have 4 references outside of family. For me, I just used people that I knew had witnessed my ability to care for children. So luckily I used to work at a daycare, so I used my boss there. I also used to, in high school and college, be a nanny for a family, and so I used that mom as a reference. And then I just used 2 good friends that knew my heart's desire and have seen me with children before. And the references are sent to them directly by the your licensing worker, and they send them back to them, so you don't necessarily get to see what they write unless they share it with you. And then you have to submit financial documents. So you have to fill out a document about your income each month, but then you also have to provide pay stubs in order to prove your financial current situation. And they do that just to make sure that you're financially going to be able to provide for a foster child, because you can look up in your area what the average payment is for foster care, but in this area, for the age range 0 to 5, it's $500 a month. And that is prorated, so it's like if you only have a kid for a couple weeks, you're only going to get a couple works week of that 500. It's not something you get the day that they are placed with you. I've only had 1 placement, and I did not receive my first payment until after she was gone. So it was like several weeks to a month after you get your placement that you get that financial aid. Now it was around Christmas time. The Foster Parent Association in this area did provide me with a gift card to help with Christmas. Also, the foster care worker gave me a $100 clothing voucher to help get clothes for the child. So there were other, like, I guess, incentives or reimbursements of that type. One thing too, financially, all foster kids automatically qualify for Medicaid, so you don't have to stress about adding them to your insurance or insurance coverage for them that's in effect immediately. I think I had my child's Medicaid number within like 24 hours basically of her coming into care. So don't worry about the insurance part. I also was told that foster kids automatically qualify for WIC or food stamps depending on their age. My placement was 4 years old. Not sure which one she would have fell into. Probably food stamps. I think WIC goes up to either 2 or 3 in this area, as far as age. But I never saw any of that during her time with me. I asked about it several times and just didn't get any answers, to be honest with you. So I don't know if you have one for a long period of time, if maybe you could get those resources in place as well. But unfortunately, mine was a very short-term placement, less than a month, just a few weeks. So maybe if you have more time with the child, maybe that can be established. But I didn't have any luck with the WIC or food stamps. The other big financial resource that you are kind of offered or entitled to as a foster parent is ABC vouchers for daycare. Now, just one little warning about this. There's only certain daycare centers that accept these. So if you're thinking about doing this and you know that you're going to need daycare, I would highly suggest you start calling around to daycares in your area and see who takes ABC, DSS, foster care, daycare vouchers. There was only a handful, maybe only 3 within like a 50-mile radius of me that even accepted it, and many of them had waiting lists. So that's another thing. Unfortunately, that's the other big whammo, though. You can't put a kid on a waiting list if you don't know their age, their gender, anything like that. So unfortunately, I applied for those, but they never came through or were beneficial for me due to the short time I had her. But again, you have them long term, and maybe eventually you could get that to kick in to help with childcare. So there is some reimbursement, but I will tell you there's so much that's going to be out of your own pocket. $500 for me didn't even pay for childcare for a month while I was at work. So if you're not financially in a good place, you want to think about how you're going to provide in the gaps where the state doesn't help you. And then the other big thing with the paperwork was if you have any animals in the home, you have to provide their vaccination records. They have to be up to date on their rabies vaccinations. I think that's the only one that's required. I have a young dog, so he's only 2, and at the time he was only 1. So he had all those like puppy vaccines too that he was up to date with, but I'm not sure that those are required. I think they just have to have rabies, but you do have to prove that your animals are up to date on their vaccines as well. Then after that, the biggest thing in the process is your home study. And that is where your licensing worker comes out and basically just looks at your home, makes sure that you have a room for the child set up. I'm actually sitting in my child's foster care room right now. You can tell behind me I have a bed that has just like a temporary gate on it as a toddler bed because my last placement was 4 years old. But this is one of those convertible beds. It actually has a piece here that goes, it's a full crib. And then this is a toddler bed, and then it can also be made into a full-size bed as well for an older child. So you do have to prove that you have adequate sleep space for a child. They do have to have their own room. They cannot share a room with you. And siblings, so there's lots of regulations on if children can share a room. I don't want to speak too much on that because I don't know all the regulations, but from a general understanding is if they're under like 5 years old, then they can be, different sex, but if they're over 5, they have to be the same sex to share a room. They still have to have individual sleep space. So that means that if I had siblings here, that I would have to have a bunk bed, or I'd have to have 2 toddler beds or something. They still can't share their own sleep space, but they could share a room. And again, not going to speak too much on that because I don't know all the ins and outs of those rules, because I primarily have signed up for just one placement simply because I am a single mom, a single parent in this role. And I just don't want to take on too much at one time. But the one other thing I had to do before they could schedule the home study was I had to go to my primary care physician and have them fill out a medical form saying that there was nothing medically that would hinder my ability to be a parent. A very basic form, but one thing I ran into this with is if you don't have a primary care established, or if it's hard to get into your primary care, which mine is always super booked up, then you need to work on that sooner rather than later and get one established, because it does ask how long you've been treated by them. It has to be somebody that has seen you on a regular basis. You can't just like walk into a walk-in clinic and get someone to fill it out. It has to be someone who knows you and has provided care for you on a regular basis. During that time frame, mine was actually out on FMLA, and so it was a whole big ordeal, and it took me several reschedules to even get in with her. And so again, just kind of backing up. So I did the application in May. I had my orientation in June. I did my pre-service training in July. I had my fire inspection in August, and submitted all this paperwork during the August time frame. And then I finally got in with my primary care in September and did that medical form. And I did that September 11th. And so we were able to schedule my home study for the following week on September 18th. And I really thought there would be more as far as, looking around the home. But it really was just a quick walkthrough and then a bunch of paperwork. She sat down on my couch and she pulled out her laptop and asked me a gazillion and one questions and typed up this whole big home study report. The other big thing is they want you to have your chemicals stored in a safe place. So I just put mine above the stove, and I have like 2 cabinets above there that are very high. Put mine up there. On my laundry room where I keep laundry detergent, I put one of those child safety knobs where they can't open the door. Things like that on my cabinets in general, like especially in the kitchen with like heavy stuff, or some certain storage counters that might have, other cleaning supplies or medications or stuff. You want to make sure they just have a lock on them. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of specifics. The other big thing was The windows, you have to make sure that you can have locks on them, but it has to be something that a child of an appropriate age could unlock in case they needed to get out during a fire. And you don't want to have anything directly blocking the window access that a child couldn't move to get to the window if they needed to. But those were really the biggest things about the home inspection. Really wasn't a big deal. Stressed myself out for no reason. And my room looks a little bit different now because I've had a placement versus what it looked like at first because I had a crib set up and all that. Car seats, if you get a placement that needs a car seat, they'll want to check that those are installed properly. Mine rode in a car seat, but honestly, we never got around to that because it was such a short placement. But I'll kind of do another video about what all that looks like and what all you have to do in that initial first few weeks of receiving a placement, because that's a whole nother ordeal. But yeah, the home study was really nothing to stress about. Don't worry yourself over it. You just need the basics. And actually, to be honest with you, I had my room set up, but she said that you don't have to have everything in place. You don't have to have your bed up. You don't have to have all that done for the home study. You just have to have it done, and they have to see it before you get that first placement. And so that was in September. So September 18th. And then after that, I was done with my end of the process, and I just had to wait for the state to sign off on it and issue my license. And they told me it could take 30 to 45 days. And I received my license on October the 26th. So just a little after a month after that. But it was very stressful and nerve-wracking, continuously waiting on a call after that. And I did not get a placement till a full month after that. It was very late November, Thanksgiving Day actually. And again, it was only for a few weeks. My child went home before Christmas. So, and it is now May again, and I have not had any other placements. So again, if you have your heart set on getting lots of calls and lots of children, be patient, because unfortunately I've heard this is quite the norm now. I thought the way they advertise as it being such a need that I get calls constantly. That's just not been the case. So I'm just patiently waiting that next placement, but just again wanted to give you the quick rundown on what all that looks like. And so please let me know if you have any questions, or if there's anything you want me to speak more about directly or address in the comments below. Let me know. I plan on doing some more videos just to let you know again what that first placement looks like and what you have to do within the first few days, as it is quite hectic. Or if you have any questions specifically about something I talked about and want more information, just let me know below. Thank you guys for watching, and look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.